All right, so where we ended off was the kind of disaster portion of our program. And there was a teacher in the district who was talking about teaching apes. And like, oh, great, I get to be depressed all year. I don't see this course like that. I see this course as we're learning from what's occurred and we're going to look forward and we're going to look at opportunities where we can be better, where every generation is better than the one before. And you guys are going to be a better generation than my generation. And part of being a better generation is learning from the past events. The other thing I want to point out when we talk about these disasters is it's never one thing. It's never one event that becomes catastrophic. It's usually a bunch of missteps, 3 or 4 things that have gone wrong that then lead to the disaster. Once again, like I'm going to say on every lecture, the things that are a different color and underlined are hyperlinks, and you guys need to watch the videos. It's one thing to sit here and listen to me ramble on this lecture. It's another thing to see these events occur from the people where it was occurring, to get firsthand accounts. So please make sure you go back and watch the videos. All right, so the disasters and 1 or 2 other laws. The first disaster we want to talk about happened in kind of the late 70s, and it was Love Canal. But again, multiple things occurred that led to this disaster. So in the 1950s, there was a housing development that was built on an old kind of dump. So there was a factory that dug a trench and took all of their environmental waste, put that in the ground, buried it. This was before there was really any regulation on what you had to do with your waste. Now, they thought they were doing a good job. They put it in a steel container, put that steel container in this ditch, covered it with dirt, and the company went out of business, and then we built a housing development over it. Okay, let's talk about some series of missteps. First, we are just burying our hazardous waste, and we're burying it in steel. And steel, doesn't last forever. And then we think, where am I going to build houses? I know. How about over the hazardous waste? FYI, housing development in high school built over a dump in San Juan Hills. Not saying this is going to be the same issue, just saying. Series of missteps. All right, so that was in the 1950s. We buried this stuff, we built a house over it. In the late 70s, we had massive amounts of rainfall in this area. And rain and metal lead to rust. And we started to see a massive amount of birth defects and cancer occurring within this community, an abnormal amount. So when we look at surrounding communities, they weren't developing cancer at the same rate as the people within this one community. That's kind of a red flag to doctors and environmental scientists as far as something's going on that is localized. And they figured out that these containers that were buried there were leaking benzene, and benzene causes birth defects and cancer. In 1976 to 1978, grassroots activism brought these problems to public officials, and it led to the area being kind of deemed what we call a Superfund site. This is put out by CERCLA, and CERCLA manages all of these Superfund sites. Superfund sites are areas where it's going to take millions of dollars to clean up and remedy an environmental problem. In 1999, they considered it remedied, and they took it off of the Superfund list in 2004, which means it no longer accounted and got money. But as you'll see in the video, there are new problems kind of popping up in this area because they were able to get the stuff out of the canal, but they're finding kind of new pockets of waste. And so maybe we're thinking not all of the waste was buried in that area. By the way, people probably knew that at one time this had been the site of some waste disposal. So why would you buy there? It was cheap. You'll see in the video that they got everyone out. And then in the 80s, they said, oh, it's clean enough and we're going to move people back into the surrounding neighborhoods. Again, why would you buy there? Because those houses were cheap. And so it kind of then becomes what responsibility does the company have now to the people who are coming up with cancer again? You knew what was there when you bought that house, and you bought that house because it was cheap because of what was there. And so, knowing all of that, what responsibility does the company have for you becoming ill? That's just a whole nother issue that we'll probably talk about at a later time. So, Love Canal led to CERCLA, led to Superfund sites, which are areas that are going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to clean up. In 1979, we see our first nuclear problem in 3 Mile Island. It's a series of unfortunate events that led to a near meltdown. The result of this was increased nuclear regulations. We saw that outside of major cities, we could have a nuclear meltdown, and we could see thousands of people damaged. And so we shut down the reactor that almost melted down, and we put stronger regulations and safety protocols in place. Took $1 billion to clean up this Superfund site because of all the radioactive material. I do want you to watch this video, and one of the things I want you to see is that they interview some of the workers, and they are sitting across the river from the nuclear reactor saying, oh yeah, there's some nuclear, stuff up in the air. And so we evacuated to a safe distance. They were literally, you could have swam across the river. That has changed as well as far as what is considered a safe distance now should nuclear reactor melt down. This was the time when the public went, maybe nuclear power is not the end all be all of clean energy sources. The CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, was actually signed into effect in 1980. So we see it first kind of put in place in 1976. It was used again in 1979, became an actual thing, a line item in the budget of the United States economy in 1980. And again, these Superfund sites, money set aside to clean up. If you look at the map, all of those red dots are Superfund sites. And then if you look at the one that's just of our area, you'll see that there's something in common with all of those tons of Superfund sites around LA. They are all part of the war movement for World War II. So they're all where we were making airplanes and we were making munitions. Those are all Superfund sites. Some of them have been remedied, some haven't. Oh, I just want to go back because one of the things I forgot to mention, you'll notice that El Toro Air Force or Marine Base is part of the Superfund sites. That is the Great Park. And so that area is a Superfund site. And so they had to go in and take all the topsoil off. And you can see areas that have not yet been turned into a park or housing. They're still working on cleaning those areas up. So it's not done yet. Okay, Bipal in 1984. Again, series of missteps. First thing we have is a United States company that is making pesticides, and the environmental regulations by 1984 in the United States are pretty strict. The unions are pretty strict. Health and safety in the United States, pretty strict. And so this company moved to India, and they decided they're going to make their pesticides in India because labor is cheap and environmental standards and health and safety regulations are almost non-existent. And so you have a factory making something super poisonous run by maybe not the most skilled labor, definitely labor that's not paid well, outside a major city, and again, a series of missteps. It'll go through it in the video. And it released 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, or MIC, that instantly killed 3,000 people. So in the middle of the night, this cloud of MIC floats over the city, 3,000 people drop dead right away. 15,000 to 20,000 then die of exposure in the following weeks. 1 to 2 million people have lifelong disabilities. And when we talk about environmental disasters, this was the worst and continues to be the worst industrial accident or environmental disaster that we've seen. And you can see the timeline there. Definitely watch the video. It talks about these series of missteps. Again, not just one thing. A bunch of things went wrong that led to this disaster. In 1985, we noticed that the ozone layer was getting really thin, and we want ozone in the upper atmosphere because it protects us from UVA and UVB light. And we were seeing that over the poles that the ozone layer was getting small and actually developed a hole. This was the first time that we saw the influence of kind of pop stars, of MTV. Back in the 80s, MTV actually played music videos, and these music videos were like miniature movies. Watch the Thriller video. I know, Michael Jackson, he's got issues, but watch that video on YouTube. It was like a little movie. And so we would sit in our rooms and we'd watch MTV, we'd watch Headbangers Ball. And it was the time of big hair bands. So, you know, the bigger the hair, the closer to God, I think was a saying at one point. And we used a lot of hairspray. And in that hairspray was CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And these chlorofluorocarbons were breaking down the ozone in the upper atmosphere. And so in the 80s, we saw this problem, and the big hair bands, the people that were out in front of the young, the people that were your age, started saying, you know what, we can't be using hairspray anymore. We have to come up with an alternative. This is damaging the environment. And overnight, we pretty much all stopped using hairspray. And if you think back to the next musical genre, so we had big hair bands followed by grunge, where we just didn't do our hair anymore. This led to the ozone layer coming back, and for the most part, it has recovered. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol, which was an international meeting of a bunch of different countries, called for the ban of all CFCs. 1986, we had Chernobyl, second nuclear reactor problem within our PowerPoint. So in the Ukraine, at this time, it was the USSR and it was the Cold War, and the USSR, the Russians, were not getting along with the rest of the world for the most part, and it was very secretive, and they had this nuclear reactor that was providing power to the Soviet Union. And a series of missteps, again, watch the two videos, led to one of their reactors melting down. So there was a fire in the reactor, and it released radioactive material into the environment. The rest of the world didn't realize that this had happened until in Sweden they started picking up the radioactive material in the atmosphere, and they went, wow, something big has happened in the world. The Soviet Union did not call for help. They didn't ask the experts around the world, like, hey, can you come in, and we've got this problem, this is melting down, we're releasing radioactive material, because they wanted to save face. And maybe if they'd gotten help, this problem would have kind of come to a quicker end. What's to note here is that only 31 people were killed instantly. Compare that to Bhopal, where 3,000 people were killed instantly. There have been approximately 5,000 cases that they can directly relate back to Chernobyl, but we think that there's possibly 1 million affected out there. Initial disaster was hidden from the world, and we are still working to contain it. And in fact, they contained it by building this big concrete sarcophagus around it, and over time the concrete wears away, and so they have built a second sarcophagus over the first. This is not a long-term solution. Anytime we put radioactive waste in concrete, which by the way is what they're doing at San Onofre, it buys you 20 years. You have 20 years before that concrete is no longer going to contain the radioactive material, and you have to come up with a different solution. In 1987, Montreal Protocol, we talked about that. International discussion about limits in ozone builds on the Kyoto Protocol that's revised throughout the years, and we expect full recovery by 2050 to 2070. And that slide was so out of order, but anyways, back to Chernobyl, and you can see the sarcophagus. The big metal one that's got concrete is actually built on rollers, and they're going to roll it back over the reactors because you can't stand over the concrete, the old one, and build because it's too radioactive, too dangerous. In 1988, we had the Yellowstone National Park fire. This challenged how the National Forest Service was going to deal with forest fires. Before this, they weren't clearing out the brush or the deadfall, and they were putting out the fires as soon as it started. This led to a buildup of a ton of fuel on the forest floor. Once this fire started, it was almost impossible to put out, and if you go to Yellowstone today, you can still see the areas that are recovering from this massive forest fire. After they put this fire out and they started looking at their procedures, Now we do backfires, we clear out brush, and if there are fires that have started in areas of a national park where you're not going to have human life at risk, you're not going to have buildings at risk, they will allow those fires to burn and monitor the burn of that because it is a natural process. This wasn't a fire set by man. This was a fire set by lightning. And so historically, we see fires like this and we need to let them burn. In 1989, we had the Exxon Valdez, again, series of missteps. I want you to watch the video that goes through the timeline of it. As you watch the video, I want you to listen to the captain's reaction when he's finally notified that they've run aground. He's very nonchalant in it. I'm not going to tell you the spoiler of why he was nonchalant. You have to watch the video. But it's important to note here. This was our worst oil spill into the Deepwater Horizon. And it happened in Alaska, a very fragile ecosystem with very low resilience. And we had 38 million gallons of oil spread over 11,000 acres of ocean. We are still 25 years later finding oil. We are still recovering. We're better, but we are still recovering from that oil spill. So it's important that we're really careful as we transport things like oil. And we'll talk about the implications of that when we get to our renewable and non-renewable resources. In 1990, we signed the Clean Air Act. Before 1990, I first moved to California around this time. And the joke used to be, in California, if we can't see it, we won't breathe it. You would look out and it would just be this kind of brown haze in the air. And all of your athletics would get shut down multiple times in September and October when the air quality was the worst because you just couldn't be outside. You couldn't go run. You couldn't go play soccer. Then in 1990, we started having stricter limits on sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that are created through manufacturing. And if you are a company that does manufacturing, you get a certain number of credits. You can release a certain number of pollution. And you would think, well, as technology gets better, these companies release less pollution and those credits just go wasted. Well, not really. If I've got excess credits, if I didn't release my quota of pollution for the year, I can sell that quota to my neighboring factory and let them pollute a little bit more. In 1997, we had the Kyoto meeting occurring in Japan, and this is a treaty to slow global warming by cutting the emission of greenhouse gases. 172 countries participated in this meeting. It was never ratified. It was never signed. In 2006, Al Gore, who was vice president at the time, released a movie called An Inconvenient Truth. Influenced by Silent Spring, looked at global warming, famous hockey stick of the increase of carbon dioxide linked to increased temperatures on the planet. And he said that we need to act on issues based on moral obligation. All right, theory of knowledge, what was the research based on? Doesn't the planet always warm and cool? Is Al Gore really a great representative? These are all things we have to think about when we watch this movie and we say he's our hero. Turns out some of the research wasn't great. Some of the ideas and theories do stand to this day. And oh yeah, Al Gore owned the largest house in his state with the biggest carbon footprint. And so you think, well, maybe not the greatest representation. What right does he have to tell me not to run my air conditioner when he's got a bigger carbon footprint? In 2011, we had Fukushima Daiichi. This was an earthquake off the coast of Japan that then triggered a tsunami, which then caused the meltdown of one of Japan's nuclear reactors. Again, the Japanese kind of downplayed what was going on. They didn't call for help immediately because they were trying to save face. This reactor is still leaking some nuclear waste into the oceans. They're still trying to figure out how to prevent it. Big take home here is that this is what led then to a complete loss in confidence in nuclear power, especially in the state of California. So when Fukushima Daiichi got hit with the tidal wave, we already had some issues at San Onofre. We had one of the reactors shut down for repair. And yes, they could have repaired it. But then we started looking at what happened in Japan and where that nuclear reactor was and compared it to where our nuclear reactor was. in an area that is prone to earthquakes, right on the coast, where we could have a tsunami. And we said, let's just shut it down. Done. We're not going to have it anymore. We have one nuclear reactor left in the state of California. It's up by Cal Poly SLO, and that one is slated to shut in the near future. Mostly because we lost confidence that we can do nuclear power safely. All right, that is the end of lecture. And we're going to move on to cheerier things in the future.